Well, hey there, you're on the internet, I have some free time, and welcome to the Triple N Network, where all you newbie nib nerds can find all the news you'll need. Let's look at an ink today, shall we? Now, today's ink is by Private Reserve, Gray Flannel, which I feel like you can see in the bottle. Definitely has some green to it. Yeah. It's a gray ink, as the name would imply, but it's a fairly light gray, as you shall see in further tests. Now, the two pens I used were this Retro 51 Tornado with a fine nib. Can't really see the F very clearly, but it's fancy and scripted. And this Pilot Vanishing Point with a Braod Nib, and I always forget you can't see the B on these nibs unless you take it out of the pen, so... Anyways, let's check out the chromatography, which, as you can see, I don't know what's going on here. Yeah, I put the drop of ink right about here, because that's where I generally put it, but even I can't see any trace of where it ever was, on camera or off. And as you can see, it absolutely flees. And then there's sort of like this khaki grayish thing, and then there's this bright green at the corners and this vibrant blue up at the top. Now, lately I've also been letting the ink dry before dunking it, which is not how you're supposed to do chromatography. But even there, I can't see any trace on or off camera where the original ink was. So this ink absolutely flees from water. So let's check out the tests. Top down to density Clairefontaine 90 grams per square meter. It's very light. In fact, it's too light for my personal use, so I'm just going to say that at the beginning. It's too light for my preference. It's not terribly easy for me to see, except in the areas where it's very dark. But as you can see, great shading. It kind of has to. If it was this dark color all the way through, I'd really like this ink. But mostly it looks very thin and watery, and actually this is my second sample of this ink, and the first one was quite the same. The fine, 6 seconds to dry. The broad, 15. As you can see, the more ink it puts down, the more it shades. I say here I think it's a 5.5 out of 10 wetness, but later on I go on to say I think it's more like a standard 5 out of 5. It's not wet, it's not dry. There's no bleed, feather, spread. No sheen, essentially no echo, well, a little bit, but it is on white background. And as you can see from the water test, it is just gone. In fact, the camera is making this a little bit darker than it is in person. You can barely see that there was ever anything there. So, yeah. Next is Rhodia, 80 grams per square meter. Again, it's much too light for my personal preference. The fine, 7 seconds. The broad, 18. It is pretty thin and watery, but that does give it very severe shading. And here you definitely see some of that halo effect that sometimes happens. So, yeah. And there's definitely like a green sort of undertone, like a foggy, hazy green kind of thing. But, yeah, again, no bleed, feather, spread, no echo, no sheen. And again, the water test absolutely obliterated. So, next is Tomoe River Paper, where, I mean, this paper is known for bringing out shading, and it definitely does here. And it also brings out a bit of a halo effect. 10 seconds in the fine, 22 in the broad. But because of the way it makes ink pool, this paper, it also makes it look incredibly thin and very light. And so, although it really brings out the dark and the dark and the light and the light, here, since most of it is light, it's just a little too thin for my personal preference. It's not easy for me to read. And as you can see, absolutely destroyed in the water test. Now, for the 20-pound copier paper, I did separate tests for both the broad and the fine. The broad took 6 seconds to dry and the fine took 2.5. Naturally, because this is probably like the worst copy paper ever, there's bleed and there's feather and there's spread. I mean, look at that bleed. That is intense. And also, look at how the paper reacted. Like, you can actually see where it started to, like, wrinkle in on itself. Boy. But yeah, and this paper, the absorbency of this paper was actually, it was struggling with the feed and the flow. So it, yeah, for these two pens have a very standard flow. Neither are overly wet or overly dry. And since this had no extra wetness in this ink, it was kind of struggling to keep up. Which was true also in the fine, where there was still bleed and there was still feather and there was still spread. But, you know, naturally it did a bit better because it was a finer line. But again, absolutely obliterated in the water test. I mean, look at that. You can see where the paper started to, like, wrinkle in on itself. Next is Mead Notebook Paper, where I only used the fine nib. I was trying to be fair. Took 3 seconds to dry. But there's still some bleed. But, as I say, it could have been a lot worse. I say there's essentially not a lot of shading remaining, but there is a bit. And there's still a little bit of feathering, but it could have been a lot worse. As you can see, it's really, really gone. In fact, it's only really readable on camera. Interesting. Huh. And lastly is Moleskine Notebook Paper, and I've opened up and gutted a new Moleskine notebook. So this is probably more like the results you'd expect from your standard Moleskine paper, which is that it's going to bleed even in this fine nib. It's going to bleed and it's going to feather and it's going to spread. 3 seconds to dry. Here I used the Braod Vanishing Point, and as you can see, even there it just didn't do well in the water test. And you can see how much it bled through. And remember, this is a fine nib, and this is a very standard flow fine nib, and this is a very standard flow ink, and it still bled through this much. So, there you go. There's Private Reserve Gray Flannel. It's definitely got some green tones to it. It's not for me, but I've known plenty of people who like it. They're big fans. For me, it's just too light. Of course, that lightness and that sort of watery quality is part of what gives it that great shading. However, for the most part, it's just too light for me to comfortably read. And it has no water resistance, which is not a deal breaker for me, but it's something I like. So, yeah, for your consideration from the Triple N Network. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe to the channel. And thanks for watching. Bye.